Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. It's the first time I've ever been to Canada, so a new place, new country. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the UK. So for those that don't know, the UK is situated just off the northeast coast of France and takes up the rest of the small damp islands there that isn't taken over by the Irish Republic. There are a couple of things that's worth looking at the slide. So our epidemic is quite concentrated. It's very much an urban disease. You'll see here people speaking later on in the conference, mainly from London and Birmingham, which are marked on the map, those who don't know where they are. We can have very, very low prevalences of disease in some rural areas, and that can change very rapidly. So parts of London, which is where 50% of all HIV cases are currently based, there are areas of London in which HIV prevalence exceeds 1%. And there are people in primary care that are seeing more, for example, HIV patients in their cohort than patients with diabetes. So enormous variations in terms of our prevalences. So what I thought I'd try and address is three questions, because we don't have a vast amount of time, and so it's probably best to concentrate on what might be interesting for this forum. So I thought it might be worth looking a little bit about whether there's really a changing need for rehabilitation amongst patients in the UK, how that might have changed over the years, what's happening to our service provision for patients with HIV who need rehabilitation, and what research is happening into rehabilitation for patients with HIV. And I'll try and address some of those, and Will help me. So if we start about the changing need, these are slides that I borrowed from the Health Protection Agency, which monitors our HIV infection, and you can see that this shows very much people that are accessing care. So we only really get up to about 75,000. We also have the problem of the undiagnosed fraction, so we have 100,000 people living with HIV in the UK. A quarter of those we do not know their status. Okay? We have continuing increases in the number of people that are under our care. In my centre at Barts Health, we now have 3,000 patients who are under care in the one centre, and we take referrals from all of North East London and Essex. There have been some slight changes in terms of what we're seeing in new HIV and AIDS diagnoses. There's a few interesting points to look at on this slide. So you can see that actually we're having slightly fewer new diagnoses in recent years. Some of this is about changing demographics of disease. So we're increasingly seeing new MSM diagnoses. That seems to be accelerating again following a dip in the 90s. The major drop in terms of the new diagnoses is really driven by the fact that our government, commonly with lots of other governments in Europe, made it incredibly difficult now for people outside the European Union to enter the UK. If anyone's ever arrived at Heathrow on a non-EU passport, they'll know the lengthy queues that are there on Terminal 3. And certainly if you come from sub-Saharan African countries, you almost can't get a visa to get in. So that in some ways we have stopped a lot of imported HIV really through immigration control mechanisms. There are some other changes in terms of we're seeing more transition into the general heterosexual population in terms of new heterosexual diagnoses. The other thing to look at on that graph is the line where AIDS and death intersects. So there were many more AIDS cases than there were deaths for a number of years, but I think now we're getting slightly more deaths than we are AIDS, and that's really driven by comorbidities. So people are dying with HIV, but they're not dying of AIDS, they're dying of other things. Okay? We also, in common with colleagues in Ireland and pretty much everywhere else in the world, are seeing the same problem of ageing. Okay? So this shows people in care from 2002 to 2011, and you can see most of the age groups appear fairly constant. There's a continual growth in the 35 to 49 age group, but significantly more people living with HIV over the age of 50, and living with HIV with significant numbers of comorbidities. This is data that we looked at in the Mildmay. I'll tell you a little bit more about the Mildmay later. So one of my junior medical staff dedicated his weekends and evenings to sitting in the dungeons, going through medical notes, because there really wasn't very much on the computer. We really looked at all the deaths that had taken place from 1993 to 2006. Now, when the Mildmay was first set up, it was very much a palliative care institution because it was in the free heart era, there wasn't effective therapy. So people would come there often because they were unable to access care in mainstream settings, or maybe they felt more stigmatized in mainstream settings, or maybe they didn't want such sort of medicalized death. Certainly when my colleagues appeared at Bart's Health, she gave me a little talk about when she first appeared and tried to put someone on Nevarapine, phoned up the lab, tried to get some liver function tests. They said, we don't do liver function tests in HIV patients. So the world has changed very much. If you look at the changes that have happened in deaths, we still have some deaths, but they're very small. So the important things on here are people do not die of opportunistic infections anymore. People do not die of AIDS-related cancers anymore. The people that are dying is being driven largely by non-AIDS-defining cancers, and you can see the dramatic decrease in people with HIV dementia, again, decreased virtually to nil. These are very rare events now, people dying from these conditions. The problem is that people are living longer. Now, this was from a review that was done by the British HIV Association in the years after HART had been established. And I really picked some quotes out from it because I think some of them are quite prophetic, even though this was done 10 years ago. So aspects that they were quite concerned about, even in that report 10 years ago, was the issue about older people living with HIV, people over 50, that they were more likely to have poorer psychological health, they were more likely to have greater comorbid conditions, they were more likely to suffer economic hardship, and they were more likely to be severely affected by HIV-related stigma. Also, the shift away from the problems associated with dying to complex mental health problems associated with living, and I think that's sometimes not very well recognised. And also a point that some people just don't get better. So even though HART has revolutionised healthcare outcomes for most patients with HIV, some patients don't get the full benefits of that, and they may feel a failure as a result. So these are things that feed into what we really need HIV rehabilitation services. I'm going to show you a little bit more data. This was a online survey which was done by the National AIDS Trust, which is a voluntary organisation that mainly looks at policy. And they had 261 patients that filled in this, and they were asked very much about their symptoms. And you can see, again, stunningly high levels of symptomatology amongst these patients, but also the fact that they're very fluctuant. So they're basically saying, yes, I have these symptoms, but they vary over time. So very much, you can frame this very much in the episodic disability framework. I'll tell you a little bit about, I have two jobs. So I work as a consultant HIV physician at major teaching hospital, Bart's Health, and also the medical director of the Mildmay Hospital. And I'm supposed to be full-time in both places at the same time, so that's often quite difficult. The Mildmay Hospital is a slightly unique facility. It's a 16-bedded inpatient assessment and rehabilitation unit. We only take patients with HIV. We don't take patients who are not HIV positive. We accept referrals largely across London, but we do have patients from across the UK. And we specialise in rehabilitating people who have complex comorbidities and often HIV-related neurological disorders. And there can be quite a large array of conditions that require inpatient rehabilitation. It's quite a big driver to get patients into units like this when there is money, because acute medicine these days is really a factory. Okay, you go in, as soon as you're well enough to go out, you're out. There are no beds. So I'm just going to take you through what we're seeing in terms of trends. And there have been some quite dramatic changes really over the last 5 years. So things that we've noticed amongst the cohort of patients that refer to us is patients are getting older. Okay? They all used to be young. We're getting a lot of 50-year-olds, 70-year-olds, 80-year-olds referred, often have quite complex comorbidities. We're having people with neurological disability, but actually it's more profound. And some of that is actually about the fact that people are surviving. So they're no longer dying with horrible neurological disease. They are surviving with horrible neurological disease and have substantial disabilities. We see a lot more comorbidities, which actually make things very, very complex to manage. We are seeing an increasing number of patients who've been lost to follow-up, who've floated out into the ether and represented again with advanced HIV. And that's a matter of considerable concern. And we're also having to learn to deal with new neurological syndromes. So patients refer with CD8 lymphocytosis, CSF escape, things that we didn't really see 5 years ago, didn't really exist. So you can see that there may be quite a lot of areas in which patients may need rehabilitation in the context of their HIV disease. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in terms of service provision and where that's gone with terms to policy. So our current provision is patchy. Many of the larger HIV centres have dedicated or perhaps what we might call semi-dedicated HIV rehabilitation teams. So while may have physios or OTs that are normally the HIV part of that team, that is only a small component of their work. And that's very much centred in major urban settings. Smaller centres outside the big metropolitan centres certainly don't have this kind of provision. Again, at the Mildmay we have an HIV inpatient rehabilitation unit with daycare facilities, but certainly if people are referred out to the more sort of generic rehabilitation world, they are now able to access rehabilitation. We no longer seem to have the issue of we don't do physio on HIV patients. That seems to have disappeared, thankfully. But there's an awful lot of variation in terms of availability, responsiveness and intensity. Some of the developments that we've been looking at recently are doing specialist clinics. So I'll give you an example. I helped set up an HIV neurology and a rehabilitation clinic at the Royal London Hospital, and the model was very deliberately having people in the room so we can really talk about what the clinical problems are with the patients and look at it from a multidisciplinary perspective. So as it currently stands, we have the sessions with me as the HIV physician, my colleague Dr. Marta, who's a neurologist, and Will as the OT, working together and looking at what we can improve in terms of outcomes for patients. We have quite close working relationships that, with psychiatry colleagues, neuropsychology, physiotherapy, neuroradiology and virology. Interestingly, I have better access to neuropsychology in HIV than the neurologists do for their MS patients. Okay? So I can get a neuropsych evaluation done in 2-3 weeks. They'll get a neuropsych evaluation done, if at all, within 2 or 3 years of referral. There have been some problems. So, as you are aware, money has become a problem all across the Western world, and situated in East London, we're very near the City of London, where people make money from playing on casinos, otherwise known as banks, and as you may see here, there is a sense really that London's sinking, and that certainly seems to be the case with our healthcare. There's been a thing called the Nicholson Challenge. I'll show you a picture of the gentleman later. So what we were told to do very recently was that we're going to have no more money. And as you can see, gradually we've had more money put into healthcare over the years, but we've now got to have no more money, and we're going to see more patients, and we're going to see them better. Okay, and the differential there is about £20 million. So I think that's about 30 million Australian dollars. Now, there are some problems with this, and if you like, soft cost savings have to be made. That's probably not really a matter of debate. The question is how you do it. And I think there have been great worries in terms of HIV rehabilitation that they're soft services. They're easy to cut. You don't notice if they're not there anymore. It's very much more difficult to take away, for example, cancer drugs from people because that makes the national papers. Patients who are marginalised with HIV, not getting rehabilitation services, don't make the national papers. Easy to cut. They are the invisible. So what I want to do is hand over to Will, and he's going to tell you about some of the things that we've tried to do to drive up quality.
only got me for a minute or two because I'm back this afternoon talking about some more things. So one of the things we did do in 2010 was set up the Rehab and HIV Association, which was basically based on some old organisations that have been running since the late 90s, OT and physio organisations. But we needed to add some gravitas so that we could actually act at a national level. So we set up, and we managed to get a formal affiliation with the British HIV Association, which was really good. So we still did our old things, which was supporting each other, supporting people working with HIV in non-HIV settings, but also we wanted to champion the HIV agenda at national level. And part of that obviously is working with our international colleagues around sort of research and best practice. Do you want to talk? Yeah.
So we've managed to get the rehabilitation agenda into a number of national standards. This was the first, really. These are the national standards for psychological support with adults living with HIV. Interestingly, there was a large committee conformed to try and get these standards so they could be rolled out across the UK. This is the minimum expectation that patients with HIV should be able to get. They got halfway through the process and suddenly worked out they didn't have anyone on the committee that knew anything about cognitive issues, so I was then seconded. And Will also made important contributions so that we can look at the way that cognitive interventions, screening, diagnosis, and rehabilitation can be applied across the UK as minimum standards.
And this led on to the next year, the new standards of care for people living with HIV, which I've got a copy of here if anyone wants to have a look at later. So they've just been recently published, and they're based on the 2000, or they're sort of a proper update from the 2007 standards, where they've been completely rewritten with the political landscape in mind. So knowing what's going on with Nicholson, knowing what's going on with cost cutting, that we need to make sure that there's minimum standards in place so that we can at least try and prove that services are needed. And one of the great things was that we were able to get sort of rehabilitation mentioned right throughout these standards. We've got minimum competencies in there for rehab professionals. We've got that you need to have minimum standards within inpatient units, that there's an agenda within the self-management program. So we've managed to get sort of, for the first time, therapies and rehabilitation actually into these national standards, which is hopefully the first step as then these get operationalised to make sure that we are able to maintain at least some kind of minimum level of quality. Cool. We're just going to talk really quickly a little bit about then what research is happening here. You've got about half of the Rehab and HIV Association committee here, and most of them are presenting today, so I'm just going to really mention mostly titles because you're going to get the detail as we go along. There's some capital R research, and these are two really exciting projects that you're going to be hearing about. So Becca, who is a physio at Tommy's Hospital in London, and Liz, who's an OT at Birmingham, are both involved in some really fantastic research that you're going to be hearing about to do with exercise and adherence and HIV-associated neurocognitive disorder. You're all at a recent Beaver conference. We've also had some papers presented on OT and physio outcomes from my colleagues at Chelsea Westminster Hospital, and Darren, who's our physio who's with us here today, is also going to be talking to some of this data as well. Esther's also here, and I'm just going to also mention, while we've been talking about Reva and while Esther's here, we've just had our AGM in the last couple of weeks, and we have a new committee. So I've stepped down as chair, and Esther, do you want to give us a wave? Esther is our new chair of Reva, and Darren, give us a wave, is the vice chair. So we're around, so make sure you get to know us while you're here. So we look forward to everyone working really well with us. And this afternoon, I'm going to be presenting a little bit of sort of service evaluation data on the program that I used to run as well. Cool. I'm technically one of those invisible people whose post has been cut a little bit, so that's the kind of context to what we're doing here. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword for us.
So I'm going to talk about some upcoming projects and just show you a little bit of data that's been presented before about things that we've looked at. So one of the things that we were really thinking about in terms of our neurocognitive things was that actually we don't have as many new incidents, opportunistic infections in the central nervous system. This is data from UK CHIC, which is a large cohort study which really looks at most of the patients who enrolled in large centres in treatment and care, and so we can get very good ideas of patterns of disease across the UK. and this was published in 2011, really showing that incident diagnoses for 4 major central nervous system opportunistic infections have decreased markedly from 1996 up until 2007. So one of my questions really was, why do we still see so much cognitive dysfunction in patients? Why am I still getting referred people with neurocognitive disease? And there are a number of different drivers, and this is probably not the time to really be thinking about it in great detail, but the French cohort, the Aquitaine cohort, really found that the biggest drivers in terms of neurocognitive dysfunction were previous neuro aids. So not current disease, but maybe old disease. And certainly I've had a number of patients who we've discovered through referral to the HRV neurology clinic who've come in, acute OI, and they've gradually sort of floated out into stable patient clinics where clearly they're not very stable, and disasters are there waiting to happen and they need to be referred back in. So what we decided to do was try and do a cross-sectional multi-centre epidemiological study looking at the prevalence of neurocognitive impairment in 2 large UK cohorts. So a cohort in East London, a cohort in South London. So these are the areas of London and indeed the UK where the prevalence of HIV is the highest. We aim to recruit over 1,000 patients. We've got to about 300 so far, and there was a really clear idea that we had that we wanted this to be dirty. Okay, there are so many cohort studies looking at neurocognitive impairment that clean up their data sets. So they have I don't know where they find these patients, because they're certainly not patients that I see, who've never been depressed, who've never had anything wrong with them, who've never used drugs, who have no comorbidities, and then they say there may be not an awful lot of cognitive impairment in the cohort. We wanted to take it all the way across and see actually what really is happening there in real life. It will also hopefully answer some of the questions about what screening tools are helpful. So when we wrote into our national standards about access to cognitive screening for HIV positive patients, the one thing we didn't write in is how you're going to do it, and that's one of the great big questions that remains. So our assessment's going to be done really much by using an IHDS, some COAT, Simeone questions, which are questions asking very much about symptoms related to neurocognitive impairment, using a HADS and a COG state, and we'll do a fairly robust assessment of demographics, comorbidities and treatment. And hopefully we'll be able to present that data sometime soon. The other thing that we have brewing that is not going to be presented at this conference is our occupational therapist is currently doing a doctorate, is really going to be looking at some of the difficulties that patients with neurocognitive disease have and trying to explore outputs on a PRPP analysis, which is an OT assessment tool, and looking at whether the therapist's identification of areas of cognitive difficulty and participants' self-ratings using various quality of life questionnaires really are linked. So often we think we're going to get a bit of discordance between what therapists think are the problem and what patients think is the problem. And this is recruiting, and I think we're up to about 30 patients. I'm just going to, as the last point, I just wanted to show you some data that was presented at the last AIDS Impact Conference, and we were quite struck at Mark May by we don't really have any way to measure anything. Okay, so perhaps as everything in healthcare now has to be measured, and you don't get any money if you can't measure it, and if you can't put numbers to it, and nobody cares about it anymore. I thought it was quite useful to try and look at, could we construct a basket of measures so to look at outcome measurements for people who have been into rehabilitation at beginning and end, and say, actually, do we do any good? Is there any point to our service? This was the pilot. We've now got a lot more data. I don't have that available to show because it's still being analysed, but at this point we had, to give you some of the demographics, so fairly evenly split between male and female. Good age range between 27 and 76 years. That shows you a little bit about with a mean of 47. Again, slight splits in terms of ethnicity, a large number of black African patients and a large number of white UK patients. About a third MSM and 2/3 heterosexual. You can see that there's a reasonable range of CD4 counts. So whilst most patients are quite immunosuppressed, so if you look at those below 350, that takes up the majority. We are even looking at patients with neurological disorders of CD4 counts over 500. Most of these are HIV encephalopathy. We had a couple of patients with PML and toxoplasmosis in the cohort, and there's a couple of others where I don't think anyone can really make head or tail of why they were cognitively impaired. They had so many comorbidities it was impossible to tease out. So what we did was we tried stuck various outcome tools together. I've just put this up there in case you're aware of what they are. So the Bartell is a fairly primitive outcome tool, which is of a global disability scale. Then we used a scale, the Northwick Park Dependency Score, and that really looks at how dependent people are in terms of their care needs. So it's very much looking at physical disability, how much input they need to provide for their care. And we also used another scaling system, the HONOS, which really looks at cognitive, behavioural and psychosocial domains of patients, so really looking at those aspects. If you look here, how did we do? Basically, it's a very easy way of looking at this slide. We basically added all the things up and beginning and end. So the higher the score, the worse you are. Okay. Now, for most patients, we can see that there's a dramatic improvement. We do have some problems with some patients in the sense that maybe didn't get an awful lot of improvement, and unfortunately one of the scaling items which seemed to be a bit of a confounder was that there are a number of patients who were admitted and became homeless, and then that puts their score into a terrible, terrible point by the time they're discharged. But I think we can say we can prove that what we're doing has some utility. Interestingly, if we look at how people improve, so the areas in which they improve, this gives you an illustration that some people do much better physically, so their improvement is really in a physical domain. Some people make much more dramatic changes cognitively, and there doesn't seem to be any real rhyme or reason why this is happening. So I thought just to finish, when we were asked to send in our workbook thoughts, I hadn't written the presentation yet, so this was a learning curve. So I thought I'd go back to those thoughts and I'd say, actually, throughout what I've shared a little bit with you today, are they actually true when we really sat down and look at what we're doing? First thought, the demand for service provision continues due to ongoing disease complexity with no decrease in the number of patients requiring it despite effective heart. I think that definitely holds, so I'll stand by that statement. I also stated that service delivery in HIV and rehabilitation continues to be strong despite the challenging funding environment, and unfortunately during that time at least 2 posts have disappeared and others are in danger of being disestablished. So the argument is, yes, we still have it, we still are relatively strong, but services are disappearing and there's risk that further services will continue to disappear. And I also stated that time and resources are continuing to hold back research into HIV rehabilitation in the UK, but actually on reflection I thought, yes, they are, but actually we're achieving more than we thought we were. An off-the-cuff measurement was we're not really doing anything, but I think you'll see from the amount of data that's being presented at this conference over the next couple of days that actually we're probably doing an awful lot more than we think we are. I was going to stop there and I'll take any questions.